So thank you guys so much for having me in your class today. I'm really excited and kind of jealous that this is what you're learning in class, because this is really cool. So my name is Kate Benson. Professionally, my name is still Kate Anderson. I write books about abandoned buildings and the history of those abandoned buildings. But I started out as an urban explorer. What an urban explorer is not something that you should try at home, because it is technically illegal because it's trespassing. But urban exploration is essentially anyone who gets in and out of places that are abandoned, forgotten, disused, decayed, anything like that. Some people also stretch it to include things like storm drains and tunnels and things like that. I stick to purely abandoned buildings. I love them. I've been exploring since I was a kid. My parents and my grandmother used to take me on weekend trips to go explore abandoned buildings. And I remember being probably about 7 years old when my grandmother, remember my adult guardian, was teaching me how to jimmy open a door with a metal coat hanger so that we could see inside an abandoned house. The reason that my grandmother was so interested in these places, and as well my parents, it was because of the history, the stories that go in and out of these buildings, especially when you think about huge buildings where thousands of people lived or worked over the years, and wondering what those lives were like and what the stories behind them were. And of course, that leads us to think about things like, well, is it haunted? And what does that look like? What does it feel like? So I kind of grew up very much obsessed with this whole idea of what are the stories that are left behind. And that influenced a lot of things for me. It influenced my photography career, and it influenced my writing, because I love to write, and incorporating these things into my writing became a really big deal for me. So I've gotten to see some pretty cool places, and some of them are kind of well known. They've been cropping up all over the internet. How many people, I can see those of you who are in person, how many of you have seen the movie Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children? Has anybody seen that? Okay, awesome. So that's one of my favorites. I loved the books, I loved the movie, but if you Google Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children, this picture that's on the screen comes up pretty frequently. People saw photographs of this particular school floating around on the internet, and their imaginations led them to think that this is what potentially Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children might look like, which totally makes sense to me after you read the books or watch the movie, that this could totally fit that mold. But this is actually Miss Bennetts' school for girls in New York, and used to be a college for girls. But when you see a building left behind like this, I mean, obviously this building is in really tough shape, and inside it's even worse, let me tell you. The floors were all buckling, and all of the plants and things were growing back in the windows. But you can easily look at this building and think, there's way more to this building than just what I'm seeing on the outside. So when I first got into exploring the bigger buildings, the first really big building that I got to see was actually an insane asylum. So this is Northampton State Hospital, which was, it's one of the oldest asylums in Massachusetts for people with mental illness. It was built in 1856, and it was also the set for a number of movies. When I first saw this place, I don't even know how to describe it when people ask me what it was like, but this is the first picture I ever took. It was a really foggy, gray, nasty winter day. And I walked up to this building that you can clearly see has no windows. They were in the process of taking it apart because they were going to tear it down. And these two kids walked up to me. And you have to remember, I'm old, I'm older than dirt. So everybody is a kid to me now. But at the time, these kids couldn't have been more than 16 or 17, probably a little bit younger than you guys. And they said, hey, are you going inside the building? And I said, absolutely not, it's dangerous. And they said, well, we know where the tunnels are if you want to come in. And I don't remember being an adult and saying maybe that's not safe, but I do remember taking off with them, not knowing who they were or what they were going in there to do. And I just went. And I'm so glad that I did, because I got to see some really cool stuff. So I went into these tunnels. Now there were tunnels all under this hospital. So imagine this giant hill in the middle of nowhere with this huge castle looking creepy building on it, and you're underneath it. You know you're underneath it. You can feel how cold it is. It's damp, and the tunnels they're wide, but they're still really small. You know you're in a tunnel. And the interesting thing is everyone always asks me, what kind of experiences have you had in these buildings? While I believe in the paranormal and I believe in ghosts, I never go into these buildings looking for signs of them, because I learned on this very first trip to Northampton that these buildings are exceptionally cold. It's always going to be colder inside than it is outside. And they're very noisy. You don't realize how loud an abandoned building can be until you have the opportunity to go in and stand in one and hear all the dripping and the creaking and the clanging. Everything's settling around you. Plaster is falling. The wind is coming through a window. And it's loud. You don't realize it until you actually get a chance to experience it. There's shadows everywhere. And if you're taking pictures and you're breathing and it's cold, you're gonna get weird clouds in your pictures. You get dust motes that look like orbs. Everybody's all about orbs. All you have to do is watch Ghost Hunters or Ghost Adventures for 3 seconds, and you're gonna hear the word orbs at least 3,000 times. Usually it's dust or light leaks or something else that's happening in your camera, as opposed to the fact that you're actually seeing a ghost. But it's pretty cool to think that you are totally seeing a ghost. So this is inside of another insane asylum. This is Westboro State Hospital. And this building has some really interesting rumors that go with it. If you get a chance, you can look on YouTube for Westboro State Hospital. And for many, many years, there was a rumor that there was a crematorium where they burned bodies on the campus, which PS is totally not true. It's actually a trash compactor, but you know, we let people have their fun with their stories. But it makes for, if you hear those stories before you go to these places, it does make you walk through these hallways a little bit differently. You're kind of on edge looking for something. Although I have to say, Westboro was one of the few places where I could actually walk through the tunnels alone and feel perfectly comfortable, which is a strange thing to say, I recognize, but it was just one of those places where I felt absolutely perfectly comfortable. This place, however, I have one of my coolest stories from. So while I say that I don't go looking for the paranormal, sometimes it comes home with me. So this is Worcester State Hospital, also an insane asylum. Can you guys sense a little bit of a pattern here with the buildings that I like? All of my students know I'm also a special education teacher, and all my students know that if they want to know anything creepy, they come to me. If they want weird stories, ghost stories, serial killer stories, they all come to me. They know. So Worcester State Hospital was torn down in the 1990s after it had a huge fire, and all that was left was this main building and a couple of hallways. And I decided I was going to come home with a souvenir. And after the slideshow is done, I will show you my souvenir. I grabbed a doorknob. I didn't think anything of it. I just picked it up. It was a nice white doorknob. I like old things. So I brought it home. And I took the doorknob off of my bedroom door and I replaced it with the doorknob from the hospital. And all of a sudden my door wouldn't close. So I figured I must have done something wrong. I mean, how do you screw up putting on a doorknob? But I'm sure somebody somewhere has done it before. And I was pretty sure that's what I'd done, was just messed up putting it on. And I didn't think anything of it until a couple weeks later when I got a cat. And all of a sudden, my cat was obsessed with this doorknob. He would sit on the floor below it and he would talk to it. And then he'd stand up and he'd touch it. And then he seemed like he was batting at something that was around the doorknob. And then he'd look around like he was following something. The door would pop open at odd times in the middle of the night. And I'd constantly find Riley just at that doorknob. He wanted that doorknob for some reason. So everyone has told me that that doorknob is haunted. So it's no longer on a door anywhere in my house, nor will it ever be. And it's also out of the reach of my current cat, because if it still has something attached to it, I don't want to know. It can live peacefully in the doorknob. I want no part of it. I've also been to some cool places that have been profiled in a lot of the ghost hunter shows, like the S.K. Pierce Mansion in Gardner, where there are so many stories about hauntings in this house that you actually can find a story for every room in this house. But the two that kind of were most interesting to me were that they said a young boy drowned in the basement, which I'm still trying to figure out how that happens. And that in 1963, a man who was staying there as a guest burned to death in his bed, and they have no idea how it happened. So people have reported hearing voices, hearing footsteps, doors opening and closing, things slamming, you know, lights going on and off in the house. I've never experienced anything when I was there, but I was also there for a large photo workshop. So there were a lot of other people there, and I was really kind of focused on taking pictures. But I have heard some pretty incredible stories, and there's a lot of really good books out there with stories about what people have experienced in this house. Same thing goes for this really cool place. This is Ohio State Reformatory, which is supposed to be one of the most haunted places in the entire world. And I got to do a nighttime ghost hunt. I don't normally do things like that, but I was doing research at the time for a historical novel that I was writing, and they invited me to do a nighttime ghost hunt. And I said, okay, I've never done that before. Well, little did I know that meant that they lock all the doors in the prison, and then they shut off all the lights. So here I am, I've just driven 10 hours to get to Ohio. It's midnight, and they shut off all the lights and lock all the doors. Of course, you get the usual people scaring each other in the dark and girls giggling as they're, you know, sneaking up on each other. But it was actually a really neat experience to walk through the building and experience some of the things that the professional ghost hunters said happened in this building. So you could feel temperature changes between some of the rooms. A lot of times your electronics would malfunction, your cell phone suddenly wouldn't work, or your camera wouldn't work, or your camera battery would die for no reason, even though it was fully charged before. And most of us would take the time to just say, okay, well, you know, temperature interferes with electronics, radio waves can interfere, things like that. But at the same time, it's really enjoyable to go through these things with an open mind and not try to talk yourself out of it. But it does kind of scare the pants off of you. But this place is really cool because it was also the filming location for the movie Shawshank Redemption, which I don't know if that's high school level approved. However, it's out there and it's a very good movie. And a lot of these places evoke such a sense of psychological terror and fear and just general creepiness that they get used frequently for movies. Like this set, this hospital is Medfield State Hospital, and it was used as a set for the movie Shutter Island with Leonardo DiCaprio, which is about a guy who gets thrown in an insane asylum. But these places have such dark and murky histories that they make great movie sets. This was also the movie set for the most recent X-Men movie, if anybody's seen that one. But there is a caretaker who works full-time on the campus who has said there's a couple of buildings that he won't go in. He does lead tours, and you can go and walk this campus and see these buildings, but there are a couple that he will not go in. And if those of us who are historians go to visit the campus, he'll unlock the buildings for us and let us go in. But he won't go in himself because he says that he can feel the people who were there and he can feel the things that they went through. Because remember, this is an insane asylum. These people weren't treated nicely in these places, and there was a lot of suffering and a lot of neglect. And most people will claim that they can feel that when they're in these buildings and they're on these campuses. This particular campus was used as the set for Stephen King's Castle Rock, which came out on Hulu 2 years ago. This is the Tewksbury State Hospital. And this place is still very much an active hospital, except for a couple of buildings. But when the casting crew decided to do some of the shots at Tewksbury, they used this as, they used the main hospital to stand in as the insane asylum in the show. But they also used another building for the second season. And you can see here, they actually boarded up the windows to create the impression that this building was more abandoned than it was. And it was really cool because we got to photograph it the day that they were building the set. And some of the people building the set stopped us and asked us what the history of the hospital was, because the crew was never told. They had no idea where they were, or the fact that they were building a set in the house that used to belong to the superintendent of an insane asylum. They had no idea that they were 100 yards away from patients with mental illness that were walking the campus. And they asked us, do you ever see strange things? And some people had some really good stories about things they encountered in the tunnels, things they'd seen in some of the buildings. And it was really cool to hear other people's stories. But again, every time that I've been here, there's been so many people and so much action that it seems like the buildings are almost more quiet because there's more people there. Now this one is really cool because this one has an actual real life mystery behind it. This is Metropolitan State Hospital, which is also known as the Hospital of the Seven Teeth. And I checked ahead of time to make sure this story wasn't too crazy for you guys, but there was a patient living at Metropolitan State Hospital who had been in and out of institutions her whole life. She had a lot of issues and she had needed a lot of treatment. And she ran into a male patient who took a fancy to her, and he started following her and started wanting to learn more about her than he really needed to know. But one day she went missing, and the hospital employees didn't do anything. They said, oh, oops, she's gone. Okay, it happens. But then the male patient disappeared and then returned. And the hospital staff thought nothing of it until they realized that in his pocket, he was carrying around her teeth because he had murdered her and buried her body, but he kept her teeth in his pocket and carried them around with him. So the legend has it that this hospital is very much haunted by the ghost of Anne Marie Davies, who was murdered by a fellow patient. And actually, a very prominent ghost hunter in Massachusetts, Sam Baltrusis, wrote a book about some of the most haunted places in Massachusetts, and he tells the story of Anne Marie Davies' murder and the murderer that carried her teeth with him, which is kind of really incredibly gross. Right next door to the Hospital of the Seven Teeth was a place called Gables Children's Center. So back in the day, if you did anything like skipping school, stealing a candy bar, pulling the fire alarm at school, things that nowadays you'd get a slap on the wrist for, you could get sent away instead. Gables Children's Center was the place that you could get sent. And this place, when I finally saw it, was probably one of the creepiest places I've ever seen. And this is some artwork that patients had done right on the walls of the rooms. And you can see the woman has little faces in her hair, and these pieces of artwork in general. This is one of the few places where I will say that I got a really bad vibe from. And it was mostly because of this artwork, not gonna lie. And the fact that some of the doors actually had scorch marks on them, and we had no idea why. Somebody had actually set fire to some of the doors, and they were metal fire doors that were meant to keep kids in their rooms by themselves. So they had these like huge locks that would have taken these huge keys, meaning that these kids were probably locked in at night. And this is the artwork that they produced on the walls of their rooms, which just was the creepiest thing I've ever seen in my life. So these, I believe, are very, very haunting, if not haunted. And I have had some of my own cool experiences. And I apologize, my dog is on the floor snoring really loudly. So if you hear snoring, I swear it's not me, it's her. She's old and she's loud.
I was worried that was a ghost or something.
Yeah, I was like,
yeah, she's just trying to set the mood. She's really just trying to set the mood. Oh my goodness. I've had some cool experiences myself that I enjoy retelling because they're things that I can't explain. So I found this house in the middle of nowhere, and I called it Green Gables because it reminded me of the story Anne of Green Gables, and I'm a total literature nerd, so everything reminds me of literature. But this house there was something about it. I walked to this house and it was still full, as if the people had just gotten up one day sometime in the 1970s, walked out the door and never came back, which is creepy enough in itself to see something like that when you see like dishes still out on the table ready for dinner, or Like obviously you can see this nice little setting with the chair. It looks like somebody just got up out of the chair after they were done reading and left. So the first time that we went there, I went with a friend of mine and none of our pictures came out. We were both taking pictures. We were both certain that we had gotten some great stuff, and neither one of us had anything that we could salvage by the time we got home. They were all out of focus. Some of them were just black frames of nothing that our cameras didn't fire at all. My camera kept turning itself off, which it had never done before. It was brand new. And this picture here of the chair is actually horribly out of focus, but I love the picture, so I kept it. And I also kept it as a reminder of what an interesting experience that was. So me being the history nerd that I am, I did some research on the house. And I found out that it was a stop on the Underground Railroad. It had tunnels underneath it. So of course I had to go back. I needed to figure out where these tunnels were, and we searched everywhere. And we finally found signs of the tunnels out in the backyard. So this is our second stop. We're determined to get good pictures this time. And again, my camera starts freaking out. Shuts itself off, turns itself back on, and my camera is digital, so it has autofocus, and it started focusing on random things. I didn't even know what it was focusing on. It just started focusing itself. I wasn't even touching it, and it was just doing its own thing. It took everything I had to stay there and continue trying to shoot so that I could get a whole set of photographs. But it was definitely an interesting experience that I will never, ever, ever forget. This is my second interesting experience. Hopefully you guys can see this. I know this picture is kind of tough to see, but I was taking this in an abandoned mill. This is a mill that had a long history of industrial accidents. So people getting hurt, maimed, and killed in this place, kind of left and right. Not the safest place to work ever. And as I was taking these photographs, we were pretty sure that there were only two of us in the building, no one else. And all of a sudden we hear windows start breaking. We just hear glass breaking everywhere. And this is as I'm taking this photograph. And in this picture, there were no windows that were unboarded. When I took this picture, I had to take a number of different frames at different settings and then mush them all together to be able to actually see the detail, because there was no light to shoot with. But look at this little guy walking up the stairs. That's what appeared after I pushed all of those images together, and it looks like someone walking up the stairs. And I was like, oh, I did not see that when I was standing there. And this appeared at the same time that there was glass breaking in another room for no explainable reason whatsoever. Of course, by the time I got home, I explained it as it had to be some sort of weird light leak that happened somewhere, or that like I bumped my camera or whatever. But honestly, there really is no explanation for this guy showing up on the stairs. So this was a cool place to go, which was Norwich State Hospital. Ghost hunters actually visited this place, and some of the set is still left over there. The ghost hunters guys are kind of interesting to me because they like to go places and taunt ghosts, but then they freak out and run away when the ghosts supposedly show up. So it's kind of fun to watch those shows because they clearly don't really want to see ghosts as much as they say they do. They don't. But this place had a violent ward. So this was for patients who were murderers. They were people that couldn't be controlled in a normal environment. So I was taking pictures in the violent ward. And again, I took a bunch of frames of this particular bureau, and then I mushed them together in Photoshop. And I got this weird black drooling thing in the mirror, which of course, again, I explained away with it had to be something with when you're photographing with a digital camera, you're taking in a lot of information that a normal camera, a film camera, wouldn't take in. So your camera is seeing things that you don't see with your naked eye. And when you start to push everything together and the digital information combines, sometimes it does weird stuff. But this one just looked a little extra weird, like maybe there was something standing behind me when I was taking this photograph, which is not a comfortable thought to sit with when you continue to go into abandoned buildings. But, you know, it's the hazards of my hobby, I suppose. But I've also gotten to see some pretty cool historical places. And I think sometimes a lot of people are influenced by the history of a place. If you know the history before you go, sometimes that makes you more susceptible to thinking about the hauntings, the potential of what you're looking at. So if you look at this photo, those of you who are able to respond to me, can you tell me what this room is, if you know what it is? What it was for?
Do I know what the room is for?
Like a kitchen.
What?
Like a kitchen.
Not quite kitchen.
Is it a morgue?
Oh,
A morgue?
yeah.
It's a morgue. It's a morgue.
Yeah, someone got it. Yeah, you have
Oh, shoot.
Excellent.
it.
Yep, so this is a morgue. So it would have held bodies, and this is the morgue at Ellis Island, which is the immigration station in New York that would have helped process immigrants coming from Europe. And you can see in the background, I pulled out one of the cool passenger lists that I found online. But I had the opportunity to tour the abandoned parts of Ellis Island. So most of it's a museum that you can go to. You can check out a lot of the information about what it was like to come through Ellis Island as an immigrant in the 1800s. But then there's this whole side of the island where there's a hospital, there's the morgue, and there's a number of other buildings that are completely abandoned. So I had gone to the Ellis Island Museum as a kid. I understood the history of immigration. I understood that there were a lot of immigrants that didn't survive the trip. I understood that there were many that came into the country who were sick and they weren't allowed to stay, or they had to stay quarantined in the hospital on the island and they couldn't go where they were supposed to go when they got here. So I think that really influenced how I approached seeing the abandoned side with the morgue, and knowing that people actually, there were actual dead bodies stored in that room. I was actually walking around in a room where they performed surgeries and where people did not survive. And I think that when you go to a place like that, already knowing the history and already knowing what could possibly be there, it makes it harder to explain away if anything strange happens. Another really cool historical place that I got to go was Carton Plantation in Tennessee. My sister actually got married in Tennessee, and my husband and I went to check out this plantation, which was actually used as a Civil War field hospital during the war. And as you can see, there's the little cemetery nearby. They have kept Carton Plantation as close to its original state as possible. And when you walk in, the tour guides are all about capitalizing on the idea that this place could potentially be haunted. And the first thing they do when you walk in is point out the blood stains on the floor. So of course you're already primed to see or feel something as you're walking through this place. And it's hard not to. You're outwardly looking for it, which I find very interesting, that you can be that influenced just by the fact that you're literally standing on a floor that has a blood stain on it from 1864. And it's cool to think of all the people that lived and died in that field hospital. So I'm just going to stop my share real quick so you guys can see my face. So here's my lovely haunted doorknob that I have held on to. Literally nothing but a simple doorknob, and it caused all that ruckus with my cat. And I've collected a lot of things over the years, and I always have people telling me, don't bring things home. But at the same time, because I have a love of history, if I know that something's going to disappear, I'll frequently bring it home with me, and I use it later on when I give lectures, when I teach, and when I share things with other people. I showed you Norwich State Hospital. This is one of the keys to one of the patient rooms from Norwich State Hospital, which is pretty cool. I have a few keys from a few different places that folks are very convinced are haunted. And I have my absolute favorite possession. So you can see my lovely collection of creepy things in my house. My house is all creepy all the time. You guys should feel very bad for my husband because he has to put up with my creepiness. And I'll tell you a funny story about that in a second. But this is my favorite possession ever. This is from the violent ward at Northampton State Hospital. These are the observation windows that used to be in the doors. So imagine you are that patient locked in a room And this is the only window you have, is these little slits. That's the only thing you can see out of. And that's the only way that you can see somebody looking in at you, is through these slits. Probably the creepiest thought ever. I did recently photograph an abandoned farmhouse for a developer, and unfortunately they're going to tear it down. It was built in the 1840s, but I got to see it. And the developer said, well, you can take anything you want. We have to clean the house out anyway. And this poor woman only died 3 years ago, so she had a ton of stuff in the house. And there was a bed that I wanted. And so I made my husband come with me and get this bed, which he was horrified by, completely horrified. And he's convinced that she died in this bed, which he might be right, I don't know. But he complained about the bed enough where the next time I was at the house, I found a big, giant, super creepy painting of the woman who most likely died in this bed. And I snuck it into the house and hung it up over the bed. And then just kind of, you know, showed him how nice the bed looked. And then he looked up and he saw that portrait. And he just busted out laughing. And he said, you know what? We've been together for 10 years. There's nothing left that you can do that will still creep me out. I was like, rats, I thought that was really going to be the one. I thought I had the winner there. But yeah, I love this stuff. I love the idea of the paranormal. And, you know, you guys obviously have an extra credit activity that you can do about the fear response. And a big part of our belief in the paranormal is human beings like to be scared. We don't always admit it, but we do. It's why we love horror movies. It's why we love mystery stories, you know, and it's also sometimes it's why we watch and read the news on a regular basis. We have this compulsion to put ourselves in situations where we may or may not be frightened. And in large part, some of the adrenaline rush of exploring abandoned buildings is, what am I going to find on the other side? What am I walking into? What am I going to encounter? And am I going to see or feel anything? You know, that potential for being scared out of your wits it's part of the fun. It really is. It's the crazy part of the fun, but it is fun. And it's interesting to take a more academic view of it, to try to find the stories behind the places that you go. And sometimes you dive into those stories, and that almost haunts you just as much as the idea of whether or not you're going to see a ghost or some sort of paranormal activity might occur. So I find all of these different ways to potentially scare the stuffing out of myself on a regular basis, and I love it. And it's become more than a hobby for me. It's become my career. I get to talk about this stuff regularly. I get to make money off of it. I get to write books about all of the places that I've been and the places that I've researched. And even though I'm writing nonfiction and I'm writing histories, I do get to talk about these crazy experiences that I've had and some of the cool things that I've seen. Especially, I mean, this has been cool being able to share all of this with you guys. And if any of you are big readers and you like to read, there's this cool book. I know it's backwards on your screen, but it's called Shadows in the Asylum. And a friend of mine took all of these fake hospital records and created a mystery within these fake hospital records. And it's super creepy. But it's a cool, quick read that you can just kind of like hop in and out of, but it'll definitely scare the stuffing out of you if you believe in paranormal, strange experiences. It's a really good book. So now I think I've done my job. I've given you information. I've recommended a book. I think that's good. I think we've covered all the bases, right?
Yeah, sounds good to me.
You learn something, you get a book recommendation. I've fulfilled my educational duties.
So now what I'm going to do is see if first, because I've written on Friday, I let students know, that you were going to be speaking with us. And so I asked what questions.
Yes, questions.
In case anyone, felt a little too shy and didn't want to ask their question in person, but I'm going to open it up to the students first. And if anyone, either on the Zoom by unmuting yourself or in class, has any questions for Ms. Benson, now is the time.
Yes, and there's no such thing as a stupid or weird question. I mean, I just told you all the weirdest stories that I have, I mean, I have more, but,
So were there any questions in here or on the Zoom before I go into my list of questions that we have?
No.
Actually, I have a question on how you got to go in some of the buildings. Like, are they like available for everyone to like go inside if they want to see, or is it like you have to get special permission from like whoever owns it?
So some of them are tourist attractions, like Ohio State Reformatory, you can go to, they give tours. The S.K. Pierce Haunted Victorian, they give tours. But most of the places that I've been, I've either had to get special permission, or when I was young and dumb, I would just break into them, which in most cases, for most of these buildings, because they've been left for so long, breaking in means walking in an open door, taking some pictures, and then safely going home. Don't try that at home. No trespassing.
I know for a fact you can talk to Miss Hearn about it. There's a place in Salisbury that is supposedly haunted, and you can do tours there, and there's paranormal activity people that go there all the time. So there's places even near where we live.
Yep.
Oh, and Pocomoke Forest, that's like right there,
They give ghost tours.
and they give ghost tours. There's
Oh,
all
nice.
sorts of stuff.
Some cemeteries do it too. If there's a cemetery that has a bigger cemetery association, I think there might be some in your area too.
Yeah, there's lots of stuff.
Yeah,
And
you
no
guys,
breaking and entering.
you have a lot of good haunted history in your area.
Yes.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead, hon.
Have you ever been to in any of the buildings that you went and you felt like a presence and you've had like uneasy feelings?
I have. So the one place that I can really point to and say that I had one of those experiences was my most recent book is about a place called Belchertown State School, where they took care of kids that had disabilities. And there was one building, they've since torn it down, but it was a place where the girls would go during the day to learn how to do things like weave and sew and make clothing. And there was a beauty parlor in there. And it should have been one of those buildings where you could just walk in, take some pictures, and it's cool. But for some reason, every time I went in that building, I couldn't stay in that building. I had to leave. All of my friends wanted to take pictures of it, and I would go in and I'd try. And I remember one day getting up to the 3rd floor and just having this feeling like I couldn't breathe. And I knew I had to get out. And I actually didn't even think about it. This is a building I was not supposed to be in. Now, just keep that in mind. Not supposed to be in this building. And I needed to get out. And it didn't matter who saw me leave this building. I needed out. And I actually busted out of a door onto a fire escape with a cop right below me. Thankfully, he didn't look up, so he didn't see me. But as soon as I got outside, I felt normal again. And it was just a building that I couldn't go in, I couldn't go near. And for the rest of the time that I explored that building, I photographed that campus for 13 years straight. I couldn't go back in that building, and I didn't.
Thanks for sharing that.
No problem.
Any other questions before I go into the written ones? Well, I know kind of going off of that of like feeling kind of unsafe, have there ever been instances, because of course I've seen all sorts of footage of urban explorers on YouTube, and sometimes they unfortunately either they just run into other people or they run into homeless individuals. Have you ever had an experience like that?
We don't have a huge abandoned building homeless issue here in Massachusetts. Most of our homeless, because our weather is fairly, we have a lot of resources for our homeless, so they don't tend to gravitate towards the abandoned buildings. What we do have an issue with is scrappers, people coming to take copper and metal and things like that out of buildings. And they are very scary and very aggressive. You don't want to run into a giant guy with a blowtorch who thinks that you might steal the copper that he wants to sell. And we run into people all the time. Sometimes you're running into other groups of explorers. Sometimes you're running into groups of, younger kids. I've seen kids as young as, 11 and 12 walking around these buildings because they've been dared to go in. It's the thing to do, especially around Halloween. Halloween, we see a lot of activity around these buildings, but never any really negative experiences. The people that we run into are there for the same reasons that we are. And, you know, it's scary at first, but once you figure out that you're both there for the same reason, you kind of go your own way, and that's that.
Another question I have, because it sounds like you are very much interested in the history of kind of the places you go, in addition to kind of the paranormal potential activity. If you had to pick one over the other, what would you say you enjoy more, the history of it or the potential paranormalness?
I think, oh God, I don't think I can pick, only because one kind of leads to the other. When you start researching the history of these places, for example, the farmhouse where I got the creepy bed from, I got a little bit of information about the woman, enough to start doing some research online. And then I had found a whole bunch of letters and photographs in the house. And I was able to piece together her family history. So the next time that I went back, I felt like she was there because I had learned so much about her. I had gotten so entrenched in the history that, again, the history itself haunts you, and you go into these places feeling like you've stepped into that person's life almost. So I very much felt that she was there the next time I was in the house, that she was almost kind of watching us do what we were doing, which was literally rifling through her things, but, you know, also trying to document what little of her life remained, because she has no family left, and, you know, she was kind of it. So it's kind of an interesting feeling. I feel like they go hand in hand. I really couldn't pick one over the other.
Yeah, I know, it was a tricky question. I know you've kind of mentioned some areas, like I know when you talked about Westboro, but what would you say would be your favorite place that you explored? Was one question.
Oh, that's always a good one. My absolute favorite place in the world was an abandoned girls' school called the Maria Assumpta Academy. That was another place where we went in for the first time. It closed in 1972, and it looked like the girls and the nuns had just gotten up one day and disappeared. And the tables were still set in the dining room. The beds were still made for the girls to come back at the end of the day. And I did find out that that's essentially how it happened. The nuns had gone quietly bankrupt, and they didn't say anything to anybody. The girls had a dance, a Valentine's Day dance, and they were told that night that they had to pack up and leave the next morning. So that's literally how it happened. They just disappeared one day. And it was just the most beautiful place to be. But there was one room that every time we went in it, it was freezing cold no matter what. And we never understood why. The windows were intact. The rest of the building was fairly warm because the heat was actually still on and there was still power in the building, which was creepy in and of itself. But I later found out that the room that was always cold was where they laid out the nuns when they passed away. They used to put them out in their coffin for people to come and pay their respects right there at the school. So that room had kind of a special attachment, and that was kind of strange, but it still remains my absolute favorite place to this day.
Cool. I need to go to some places legally. Another question, I know you mentioned at the beginning that it sounded like your grandmother had kind of a lot of influence into exploring. Are there other things that kind of made you choose to do kind of urban exploration and interested in the history behind areas?
I think it all started with my love of creative writing, more so. As a kid, I really liked creepy books. I liked Christopher Pike and R.L. Stein. I really liked scary things. But at the same time, my parents also kind of instilled in me the love of history, and with history comes landmarks and buildings and places that are no longer there, or places that are no longer operating. And the city that my parents are from, Springfield, was once called the City of Homes. And now it's one of the most impoverished and crime-ridden cities in Western Massachusetts, and it happens to be where I teach. And the high school that I teach at is the oldest existing high school in the city, still being used as a high school. Our building was built in 1915, but it was built across the street from the Springfield Armory, where part of Shays' Rebellion happened, and there were tunnels under our school. We were built on top of a church that burned down. So a ton of history, and you can't get away from abandoned buildings when you talk about history, and you can't get away from the idea of things that once were but aren't any longer. And I think that's what led me to urban exploration, was that need to know what the stories were that were there that aren't there any longer. Who were the people, you know, in that weird photograph that you see of, you know, a building in 1915? What were their stories? Where did they end up? And sometimes you stumble on these little mysteries that just kind of take you along for a ride. And I think that that's why urban exploration ended up being my outlet for history, was just the, you know, it's the curiosity factor, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Which I think we had mentioned in the group seems to also kind of relate to being interested in special education, just the understanding things.
Absolutely.
And then kind of the final question that I have, because I know actually fairly soon a bell's about to go off for our 10-minute warning before school's over. Is there any, because I mean, it sounds like, you know, you're urban explorer, you're a teacher, you're writing your own books. Like, is there anything, any advice that you would have for, you know, the students that are listening, for either just advice in general or advice for, you know, if they think that this sounds cool, if they want to, you know, write their own books or go into urban exploration?
Absolutely.
What advice do you have for them?
Just always be curious, and don't ever let anything deter you from learning. If you're not a solid reader, who cares? You can do research in other ways. If you're not a big writer and you don't have the patience for it, who cares? You could still write a book. There's so many ways to get into some sort of interest like this. For me, it was photography. You know, picking up an old junky camera can be an absolute blast. Learning how cameras work is a lot of fun, and it sometimes you can learn about facets of yourself you didn't know were there just through experimenting with art. And I mean, for me, I've always loved to write. I write all the time, and there's so many options for, you know, voice to text and, you know, ghostwriting and things like that. People that can help you write, that if you ever wanted to write a book, there's no reason not to anymore. And you can publish yourself. You don't even have to have a publisher any longer. You can do it yourself. There's a fantastic series of ghost stories on Amazon that are all quick, short reads, but they're written by people that just really wanted to write a short ghost story, and Amazon published a whole bunch of them and just threw them out there for people to read. And it's a really cool thing. Just, you know, always indulge your curiosity. If you say to yourself, I really wonder, follow it through and figure out where it goes. Sometimes it takes you to places that are really unexpected, and you learn things that you never thought possible.